Today, we're diving into a story that doesn't get told nearly enough. We're talking about the experience of being the only one, specifically what it's like for young Black women growing up in spaces that are overwhelmingly white. And the foundation for this whole explainer comes from some really powerful academic work. It's a 2015 thesis from Smith College by Jessica L. Ricardo, and it's all about bringing this often erased experience into the light. All right, let me ask you something. When we talk about the Black American experience, what's the first image that pops into your head? What's the typical story we hear? Because, as we're about to see, the story we usually tell, well, it's not always the whole story. And that brings us right to our first section, the incomplete narrative. We're going to look at the stories we always tell, and maybe more importantly, the ones we don't. So what does that dominant story usually look like? Well, the focus is almost always on urban communities, right? And often it's framed around financial hardship. But here's the key thing. It almost always assumes there's this built-in Black culture surrounding everything. Elders, peers, the whole community. But what about the growing number of Black families in places that are mostly white? That's the part of the story that just gets missed. And that is exactly the gap this research is trying to fill. The idea isn't to say the other stories are wrong, not at all. It's about making the picture bigger, adding this really vital experience of being one of the only ones. So that leads us right into the heart of it, the only one experience. You know, you can read all the reports and see the data, but what does integrated actually feel like on the ground? 2%. I mean, just think about that for a second. 2%. Imagine what it's like to be part of that 2%. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some official reports will look at a community with, say, 2 to 7% Black families and call it integrated. Sounds good on paper, right? But this research argues that when you're living it, the word that comes to mind isn't integrated. It's isolating. And there's actually a term for this feeling. It's called racial dissonance. Basically, it's what happens when you're in a school where your racial group is less than 20% of the population. It means you're just constantly aware that you're different. So what does that do to your sense of self, especially when you're a teenager? That brings us to our next section, identity under pressure. We're going to see two really powerful forces basically colliding. The research breaks this down using two big ideas. First, you've got what's called Erikson's identity crisis. That's the internal question we all ask as teenagers, right? Who am I? But then you layer on something called objectification theory, and that's all about the external gaze, the pressure of how other people see you. So now the question becomes, who do they see me as? And you can see how this gets complicated fast. I mean, it's already tough enough for any kid to figure out who they are. But imagine doing that while also having to navigate how an entire dominant culture sees your body and your identity. It's a whole other level of pressure, which leads to this really critical concept in the research, losing the buffer. Think of it like a protective shield. And what happens when that shield just isn't there? So a lot of research on this topic talks about a cultural buffer. The basic idea is that a strong community of Black elders, friends, and mentors acts as a shield. It gives you counter-narratives and different ways of seeing beauty and success. Basically, it protects you from only being exposed to dominant white beauty standards. And the difference it makes is huge. You know, with that buffer, you've got peer support, you've got shared experiences, you see people who look like you. But without it, well, that's when you're much more likely to internalize the dominant ideals. And that can lead to things like body dissatisfaction, feeling like you're invisible, and it's a real risk to your self-esteem. Okay, so this brings us to the big question. Why does any of this matter? This isn't just theory. It's about moving from not seeing this experience at all to actually understanding it. There's a quote from the thesis that just hits it home perfectly. It says, "The experience of being the 2% Black in a 98% C is in fact isolating." And it goes on to say that it's so isolating that it stands to threaten the self-integration of the Black adolescent girls in those spaces. Wow, it literally threatens their ability to form a complete sense of who they are. So who really needs to hear this? Well, obviously, social workers, teachers, counselors, anyone who works with kids, really. They're on the front lines. But honestly, this is for anyone who wants a fuller, more honest picture of the American experience. And so that really just leaves us with one last big question. Because it's one thing to point out a problem, but it's another to think about solutions. So how can our communities, our schools, our neighborhoods do a better job of making sure every single person, and especially the only one, feels seen, feels supported, and feels whole?